My name is Edgar Mannheimer, and this is Kalam, a podcast about the Middle East.
The legacy of Syria's al-Assad dynasty being dragged through the streets of Hama. The head, all that's left of a statue of former President Hafez al-Assad, whose son Bashar now faces a renewed insurgency spreading across the land. From Hama, the rebel groups who last week captured Aleppo are on the march south towards Homs, the next city on the road to Damascus.
The Syrian civil war, which never really ended, has yet again been ignited. Many describe the conflict as frozen, which really hasn't been the case. What we've seen is a kind of uneasy calm, as Russia and Turkey agreed on a ceasefire agreement several years ago. But clearly, all it took was one of the major players in the war, namely Hezbollah, to be weakened for city after city to fall into rebel hands. So, who are the rebels and how have they gotten this far? In short, former al-Qaeda members formed a new group with similar Sunni Islamist leanings called Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, the Committee to Liberate Syria. We'll call them HTS in this episode. Their main opponents are the Assad regime and the Syrian National Army. Bashar al-Assad has managed to stay in power only through the support of Russia in the air and Iran and Hezbollah on the ground. But due to Israel's devastating hits on Hezbollah leadership, HTS saw their chance and took it. It began with Aleppo, Syria's second largest city, then Hama, and as of a few minutes ago, Homs. By the time you're hearing this, they may well have taken Damascus as well, rendering this episode very out of date. I'm personally uncomfortable with the term liberated, because as much as I despise the Assad regime and its brutal, backwards, authoritarian, Ba'athist dictatorship, I don't think a bunch of former al-Qaeda jihadists are going to be any better. Non-Sunni communities, especially those belonging to the Assad family's Alawite minority, are already fleeing the cities now under HTS control. On today's episode, my esteemed colleague Nora Adin Fares interviews Dr. Neil Quilliam, an analyst and associate fellow at Chatham House, and we dive deeper into what all of this means for the Syrian people. So, without further ado, here's Neil Quilliam.
Hello and welcome to Kalam podcast. Today diving even deeper into the latest developments in Syria and the situation that has been unfolding for the past week. To help me sort everything out, I am joined by Dr. Neil Quilliam, Associate Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House. Neil, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting me.
Of course. I told you just now that I have a very hard time grasping the situation that is happening and unfolding in Syria. So first and foremost, what is happening? What is going on right now?
So there's a lot happening, and it's happening simultaneously. But in essence, you have a rebel group in the north. I mean, there are many rebel groups in the north that are capitalizing upon this moment in the region to bear down and press towards Damascus. The goal, the objective is to overthrow the Assad regime. I mean, to outside observers, this seems to have come from nowhere. I mean, no one was talking about this or forecasting this, 6 months ago or a year ago. There were signs that things were shifting and moving. So I think a lot of outside observers would be shocked at what's happening, the pace that it's happening, and we've come back to this question that so many have been asking for a long time. Is Assad toast? Is this it? Is the regime over? His demise has been predicted, many times. And I think a lot are still sort of holding back on whether that's going to happen. But I would say at the moment, this is the nearest it's come. But maybe we want to unpack that a little bit more.
Yes, Jesus, that is very ominous, and also because this is happening at such a quick pace, I feel like um, the how do you say the vastness of it is a bit difficult to grasp. I remember when we were talking about the Arabic Spring, then we could see it basically happening and spreading from country to country, and it was kind of understandable that it would have some ramifications and it would be a big event. But this just, is there any resistance on ground, or is it just that city after city is being taken over?
I mean, this is almost like unfinished business. You know, people talk about the conflict being frozen or there being a status quo. Whilst those terms are helpful, I never really saw it as frozen. You know, we look at older conflicts that were frozen during the Cold War, where you had two major superpowers holding a conflict together. We haven't had that. We've had basically sort of an interregnum or a 4-year pause in the conflict. But beneath that ice, there's been a lot of movement going on and a lot of movement taking place. And so what we're seeing now very much is HTS in the north, which is the main fighting group that we're seeing at the moment. There are plenty of other groups that are fighting alongside and fighting in other areas of the country, has spent the past 4 years. I mean, it hasn't been sort of sat, twiddling its fingers. It's been preparing for this. It's been, organizing, training, getting its weaponry in place. Also, developing governing structures as well, and sort of embedding itself deeply, within Erbil. And what we've seen at the same time is that the Assad regime has characterized what we've seen over the last 4 years as a status quo. It's spent a lot of its time actually enriching itself, practicing, its predatory corruption. It's managed to develop and finesse, the Captagon trade along with others, and it's spent a lot of its time and energy there rather than sort of fortifying itself in training its troops, in equipping and resourcing its troops. So there's on top of that as well, there's a lot of deep dissatisfaction in the country, even those in the regime-held areas, because the regime has not been, servicing its constituencies. So as HTS and the other groups have been mobilizing and pushing down through, they haven't faced a lot of resistance, certainly not from the Assad forces. They've been withdrawing. But most of the populations are, welcoming them, opening their arms to this. So it's that classic phrase, which I really don't like, but it's like dominoes, that you can see them almost falling. And, the forces are now just outside Homs, and it looks like Homs is the next city to fall. And then it's Damascus.
Yeah. What do you think if they reach Damascus? That might be in a couple of days even. We're talking a very fast-paced overtake. Do you think that Damascus will fall as well?
Forecasting this is
a bit difficult.
Really and I think so many, including myself, have made these forecasts in the past, and it doesn't work out. But this is my analysis of the situation. Unless the Russians intervene, and that means a large scale intervention, and I don't think that that's not going to happen. I don't think, unless the Iranians or the Iranian-backed forces are going to intervene, and again, that's not looking like a likelihood. There is a very high chance that the regime is going to fall. Maybe taking Damascus will be a harder task. From what I understand is that the forces are fortifying Damascus, but no one would have predicted that Aleppo could have fallen so quickly, or Hama would have fallen so quickly. So we could be sat here in a week's time and the Assad regime has gone. But I put a lot of that down to Russia and seeing what Russia does next, if anything. But I mean, its embassy this morning has advised Russian citizens to get out of the country, which is not a very positive sign, right? That doesn't indicate that Russian forces are going to come to the rescue.
Exactly. I do find it it is scary how quickly things can turn in this way, especially because just a week ago it seemed as if some type of peace was reaching Lebanon, and things were coming down between Israel and Lebanon because they reached a ceasefire agreement. I find the timing of this very interesting. Does this have, is this interconnected in some way with the ceasefire that we saw in Lebanon, or is it random that it happens so quickly after the ceasefire agreement?
I don't think, I mean, I definitely don't think it's random. I don't see some hidden hand there either, sort of, manipulating or working behind the scenes. But I mean, if we think about what we've seen, over the past year, over the past 6 months, I mean, Hezbollah was seen as this impregnable, strong, fighting force. And I think everyone has been quite shocked at how the Israelis have just picked it apart.
Completely.
I mean, right? I mean,
yeah.
I mean, they took out their comms. The Israelis spent a decade, I'm sure, a decade at least, figuring out how they're going to take on Hezbollah. And I remember, in my various jobs and my various research, I would think, at some point Israel's going to have to take on Hezbollah, but it's got 140,000 plus, missiles bearing down on it. How on earth is this going to happen? I mean, the conflict is going to be like nothing else. 2006 is going to be nothing compared to that. And yet they found their way. So we've seen this kind of behemoth of Hezbollah just completely vanquished, its leadership taken out. So I think some of the assumptions that we hold dear or we imagine are no longer there. So it seems that everything is possible. I remember, a decade ago, whatever, we would look at Saudi Arabia, and we would look at some of them, the change in the succession, and we would look at the moves being carried out after 2015, but by MBS, and there was thinking around that the Saudi Arabian National Guard, which had been the bedrock of the late King Abdullah, this would guarantee that no move could be made against senior princes. But again, it was a paper tiger. It did nothing. So it's really interesting. This really challenges our thinking, I think, across the region, that you have these institutions that are fearful, but actually, if you poke them, they do fall apart.
Yeah.
And we're very much sort of seeing that at the moment. And so to answer your question, I think seeing how Hezbollah, A, was taken apart so systematically, and B, that it no longer has that capacity, will, or even command and control that it can come to the aid of the Assad regime, sent a very strong signal to HTS. I think its leadership saw this as a moment. It's been preparing, like I said, not a frozen conflict. It's been preparing and waiting for the next round of conflict. And that was it. That was very much the moment to press, and it's done so, and it's just pushed away the regime almost, right down to Damascus.
So I imagine that the goal is beyond removing the Assad regime from power. What other goals is there from this movement?
So this is where it gets a little bit sticky and difficult and complicated.
Okay.
I'm
ready.
Because I mean, HDS, has stated very clearly it wants to run Islamist state according to Sharia in Syria. It wants that. That's what it wants, right? That's its goal. It has no pretensions. It does have a history or a legacy coming from Al-Qaeda in Syria.
Perfect. Amazing.
But it's spent the past 4 years sort of distancing itself from that, trying to demonstrate, certainly, in Idlib, that it can govern in the interests of the whole community. It's interesting that al-Julani, the leader, over the past week, has been sending out, I mean, they've got a very good Stratcoms team working with them, sending out messages that, we want to govern in the interests of all Syrians. We want to, Alawi, Ismaili, Kurd, whatever, Christian, we're all Syrians, we're all in this together. So this is not, and there's a sort of very deliberate campaign to sort of push out. We're not Al-Qaeda, we're not the Taliban. We do want this rule, but we all want you to be part of this. This is, this is a Syrian-led, Syrian-driven Syrian campaign. And to a certain extent, one of its predecessors, Nusra, was very much about taking a kind of an international Al-Qaeda franchise and making it a Syria, a Syria-driven, Syria-led campaign. So that's the goal, right, of HTS. Where the Jews communities fit into that, where the southern Syrians and Daraa fit into that, or how the Kurds fit into that. I'm not sure that's been worked through or managed or cooperated, and I think that if the regime falls, then that's going to become the next question. But this to me feels like a little bit like, let's get the revolution over, and then everything's going to be fine. The other side will address all those issues.
Okay, we'll deal with you guys later. We'll take it later. I don't know if that is such a good tactics, especially because I work a lot with migration and especially the migration crossings across the Mediterranean Sea, and not almost every, but the majority, a vast majority of the people fleeing are coming from Syria, and it has been like that for quite a lot, like a sizable amount of years. And people are fleeing, they're fleeing the regime, but they are also fleeing the Russian influence in the country. I remember one time when I was on board one of these rescue vessels, and I talked to a man from Daraa, and he was explaining to me how the streets do not belong to the people, they belong to the Russians, they belong to the Iranians. But can you explain that a little bit? What does Russia have to do with Syria? Because in some ways that can sound a bit abstract. Like how did they end up there? What's the history?
Okay, so Syria and Russia have a very, very long history, and it almost predates the Cold War. But let's put it just in Cold War context. Soviet Union, US, you had the patron-client state relationships. Syria was one of the few countries in the region that had a good relationship with Russia. It's Russia's competition with the US sort of led to this kind of patchwork of states that were either allied to one or to the other. In 72, Egypt had been an ally of the Soviet Union, but in 72 it flipped. It went over to the US, and this sort of left almost Syria as its one major key country, sort of in the Middle East as such. I mean, it had relationships in Yemen and elsewhere, but it was a key kind of frontline state and relationship. And the Soviets built, its base in Tartus. It trained Syrian officers. It supplied, its military equipment, agricultural produce. There was a very strong connectivity between the two countries. And Syria's officer corps would go to Moscow and be trained. So there's a long kind of deep history between the two that was founded on the Cold War. So that's remained there. And as a consequence of that, the Soviet Union and what became Russia has significant military assets and bases and ports in Syria, which give it access to the Mediterranean. So that's kind of where the interests lie. It's of strategic interest to Russia, and Soviet Union, Russia has always been a big backer and supporter of Syria. So that's been a key relationship. And during the uprisings, during the revolution, this was not something that Russia was willing to give up.
No, of course not.
Right? So it supported Bashar all the way. But by September 2015, I mean, the regime had really been on the back foot for a very long time. Whatever rebels, opposition, however you want to characterize it, were really beginning to make inroads, and it looked like the regime was going to fall, basically. And then the Russians just suddenly, you know, like the cavalry for the regime, just arrived and landed wholesale in September 2015 and just changed the dynamic on the ground. You know, it came with its military hardware, it came with its full support, and it complemented some of the Iranian support, some of the Iranian-backed support on the ground, and it really changed the direction of the conflict. It saved it saved Assad, but obviously in doing so, there's a price to pay. So I've just published a book on Syria last week. I mean, the timing is spooky.
Yes, it is.
And it's a text that's intended for undergraduates, and I use international relations theory to explain how the regime has survived so far. And like, you know, the punchline really is that what the regime did was it sort of mortgaged itself and mortgaged the country to two main actors. That's Iran and Russia.
Yeah.
And in doing so, it gave both of those players, you know, it gave them part of the sovereign territory. It gave them access to key resources in the country. Russia's maintained its access on those key military assets. And it's basically both those countries, Iran and Russia, enabled the regime to hold up. And if you think about now, I mean, so Russia is engaged in Ukraine and obviously invaded in 2022. It still sees Syria, or still sees its assets in Syria as strategic, as an important part of its competition with the US and other players. But it doesn't seem willing to do a heavy lift yet again.
No. Okay. All right. Well, that is a very good explanation, actually, because I do find it very interesting the way it seems as soon as a Western country kind of comes into the Middle East, it's just that bound to happen. It's just a bad mix. It never fits well. It is always a bunch of conflict around that, and especially looking at this now, like regardless if the Assad regime falls or if they don't fall, what could be a potential outcome from both scenarios? Like, what's going to happen to the rest of the region? Could this affect nearby countries in any way if they fall? And how could it affect it if they don't fall?
Yes, I mean, so in both scenarios, and what I'm going to say now, it's not value driven. So I'm just going to give you my analytical point of view, right?
Give it to me.
So let's say the regime falls, HTS comes in, okay, and takes over. Whenever there's a government is displaced in this fashion, it's going to be messy, right? It's going to be violent. It's going to be messy. There's going to be no easy, lovely, peaceful transition or transformation, right? So I think Syria is going to probably be in for several years of more conflict. But what's going to happen in the region is that the neighboring states, very, very concerned. Jordan, just to the south, it started to normalize. It's been normalizing for the past couple of years with the Assad regime, sort of having come to this realization for themselves that nothing was going to shift, nothing was going to change. They had called for him to go years before. They're going to have to cooperate with the state. They sort of led the charge really with the Emiratis and the Saudis coming behind that. And there was a sense like, okay, it's time to move on from where we are in this status quo, if you like. Let's see if we can let's begin to normalize with Assad. Let's bring him on board. He has to fulfill a certain number of conditions. One is to end the conflict, to create the conditions under which refugees can return. And obviously that's a very complicated issue, right? Because I certainly wouldn't go back if Assad were there. And three, to stop the flow of Captagon coming down through Jordan and down through the Gulf, in return for normalization, step for step it was called, and that means reconstruction, essentially. So we pull him on side, and the broader idea is to pull him away from the Iranians, not necessarily from the Russians, but pull him away from the Iranians and kind of bring him back into the Arab fold. So that's where they were tending towards. they made no progress because Assad just kind of, cashed in all the benefits and gave nothing back. Captagon still flows. Captagon is still, a major threat. Obviously, the conditions in the country are not such that refugees can return, and no, and the big piece, no movement on political settlement whatsoever. But they're all watching in dread and in fear that if you have an Islamist organization that's coming to power in Damascus anytime soon, that in itself will constitute, this is how it's seen, will constitute a direct threat to their interests. So they're all concerned in and around that piece. However you characterize it, HTS is proscribed as a terrorist organization by most of the European countries, by Turkey, by the US, by the UAE as well. So no one really wants a terrorist organization to come and govern the country, right? Next to them or in the region. So there's that side to it. There's the other side. It's if he survives, and obviously that's a huge if. And if Russia doesn't really come to the rescue and Iran is unable to do so, then arguably he may be more pliable to coming to some kind of political settlement where there's a power sharing agreement. HTS and others have demonstrated their clear capability to sweep him away. He may then, so his vulnerability, his dependence upon Russia and Iran may then become a sort of vulnerability or dependence on regional actors and international actors that may give him a lifeline and say, okay, this is the time. Now, we work towards political settlement. Now there's power sharing. Now there's going to be elections. And next time you don't stand, this is your exit, but you're going to have a clean exit rather than the Gaddafi exit. Now, that sounds great in theory, and nothing ever goes as smoothly as it would. So I can't see that playing out. I mean, it's a little bit sort of like a fairy tale. That would be one way of stopping complete bloodshed and getting rid of Assad and then putting in place, a democratic representative government. We're not going to get that, and I think with HTS, if it does take over, I think it's going to be a lot of bloodletting between the different groups that have been fighting the conflict, for the past decade or more. But that's not to say that, I mean, if you're watching the footage of the forces, the rebels entering these towns, everyone obviously is delighted because the regime has been thrown off. 30, 40 years of brutality are just being lifted. So there's this absolute euphoria, obviously completely understandable. And this is like this moment, and no one wants to take that away, of course.
Yeah, exactly. It's a celebration, but the question is how long-lived that one is going to be, regardless of which direction this takes. I am a bit fascinated by the HTS as a group, because you say that they have been mobilizing and preparing for this moment for quite a long time now. But how can they be so strong? How many fighters do they have? Are they operating all alone, or do they have someone else partnering up with them?
I mean, so in a way, they're an amalgam of a series of groups that were, rebel forces, ranging from Al-Qaeda to, other there are lots and lots of rebel groups. They've all kind of congregated in Idlib, come together, effectively kind of put aside their differences, and they're fighting for one goal, for one outcome. They've more or less been left alone for this 4 years because the conflict was just on a pause, and they've been supported. I mean, there's this idea that Turkey has been supporting them. I'm not sure that Turkey has been supporting them. Turkey has been supporting other groups, SNF, on the ground. Turkey's interests in all of this are around borders, around refugees, and around the Kurds. They don't want the Kurds to have autonomy, certainly within Syria, and certainly not an independent state. So so that's an issue around there. But HTS has been backed by very wealthy individuals from the Gulf, we'll put it that way, probably from Qatar, from Saudi, from the Emirates. And they've been building and fortifying for this time.
This is such a complex conflict, to be honest. And I think that in a lot of ways, when all of these events are taking place and you have such a huge political activity going on, and it is very difficult to say what is going to happen, what is not going to happen. I would want to ask you, what do you think will happen to the people that live in Syria? What's going to happen to the Syrians in the middle of all of this? Do you think it will be a bloody conflict, especially if HTS managed to get to Damascus anytime soon? Will the people be kind of like in a jam between the Assad regime and the HTS, or do you think that this will go over very quickly and then people will be fine in some extent?
I mean, I definitely want to say the second. I mean, I think what we're seeing at the moment is hopeful, right? And why I'm saying that is because so the regime forces have just melted away. Defections have been on a very large scale. You can actually see that taking place. And part of the reason is because the regime itself became so focused on enriching itself and engorging itself. It paid little heed or attention to the population in its own areas. So it's not just that those outside the regime-held areas, disillusion sounds a ridiculous word, but disillusioned, right, with the regime. I mean, there's angst, there's hate, there's all of the things that are there. But even those within the regime areas, you can see that. So as the regime falls away, and again, that's all dependent on Russia, as I see it. If it falls away, I think there's just this moment like of collective national relief. It's not, there are still pockets of resistance to the opposition coming, but I think there's an overwhelming sense that this 40-year history or whatever, with the Assad dynasty is over, and now, breathing that fresh air. But then the question, really is what comes next? What comes after? And that's all about the governing and how can this group that sort of set up shop right up in the north and has been practicing governance, how can it then govern or manage to govern a whole country? How can it spread that across? I mean, it's impossible is not the right word, but that's such a massive task, right? Doesn't matter how optimistic we are or what ideology you want to push forward. I mean, taking over a country or managing a country that's been in conflict, for the past 13, 14 years is huge, and nothing is going to be easy. What structures, what institutions do you put in place on a national level? How do you? I mean, one thing is that civil society organizations have been embedded, have been developing great capacity and skills right across the country. So at a local governing level, Syria is probably in a much stronger position than it is on the national level. So it's then how do you manage and how do you integrate local governance structures with effectively new national governing structures? I mean, Syria and Syrians are going to need all the help they can get. But if the ruling party is a proscribed organization, then I'm not sure what help it's going to get, right?
No. That is, it's a big what if, and it's a very big question. And I think that this is a very good place to actually call it quits for this conversation. I just want to ask you, is there anything that you would like to add that I haven't asked you about yet?
No, I mean, I think my one sort of takeaway with all of this is that it's not easy, but we can sit and we can think about these big issues and these broad issues, but at the kind of micro level, at the personal level, at the family level, I mean,
Syrians have been so deeply traumatized. There's so much to think about, so much to kind of unpack and to understand what policy prescriptions would be to, to look at sort of bringing Syria kind of back. So when you're talking about big issues like, is Assad going to go, or is Russia going to come in? These are big issues, but it's really more the everyday things that are ultimately going to matter, I think, and how people live their lives. We've seen that, like in the US, people care about inflation or its cost of living. It's those issues that really affect you on a daily basis. And I think that's so for external powers, if they're looking, to support the country, they've really got to get a handle on that as well. It's not just the huge issues.
Yeah, it is basically going down to the people and helping them out, because they are the ones constructing the country. I completely agree with you. Thank you so much, Neil, for joining me today. This was great. I do feel like I have gotten, I don't understand the conflict in its entirety and its complexities, but quite a lot more than before this conversation.
Excellent. I'm glad I could help.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was Dr. Neil Quilliam and the 34th episode of Kalam podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. To support the show, please consider subscribing to us on Patreon for just $3 a month. And please subscribe to Kalam podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Today's interview was conducted by Nora Adin Fares. Sound design was by Arthur Mannheimer. And I'm your host, Edgar Mannheimer. Peace.